I thought the oranges might still mean something. They were from the tree near the back fence, older than I am, thorny and quiet about its sweetness. I had wrapped them in the same checkered cloth I used when Nathaniel was little, the one with fraying corners and a brown stain from blackberry jam that never quite came out. I tied the bundle with both hands, slowly making sure none of the fruit touched the skin of the bag. It was something I used to do when we had less. Old habits packed themselves in silence. The bus dropped me off at the corner just after noon. I didn't ask for a ride. I figured 6 hours wasn't that long if you're carrying something light and staying quiet. The last time I visited Nathaniel was still building the house. Back then, the driveway was gravel, and he offered me water in a mason jar. Now there's a gate with a voice box and men in suits who don't recognize me. I stood just outside the metal frame where the camera tilted slightly down. One of the guards stepped forward, a man with short sleeves and a clipboard. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "I'm Geraldine Monroe. I'm Nathaniel's mother." He blinked once. "You're not on the list." He didn't say it cruelly. Just a flat fact, as if that explained everything. I adjusted my grip on the oranges. They'd grown heavier. "I'm here for the launch," I said, "of the new foundation. The article said it was today." Another guard tapped something into the keypad. The first one pressed a button on his radio. He kept glancing back at me like I was a puzzle missing its edges. After a minute, the gate buzzed. A voice behind it said, "She's not invited. No entry." They didn't say my name. Then he came out. A slim, black suit shoes without dust. He walked like cameras might be watching, even when they weren't. The same boy I once carried up 2 flights of stairs when he had the flu, now standing at the gate, like he'd never met me. "Nate," I said quietly. He didn't flinch. Behind him walked a woman with perfect silver curls, skin like porcelain behind designer glasses, and a blazer that probably cost more than my whole trip. She was the one from the magazines. Patricia Langley, self-made philanthropist, adoptive mother of orphaned genius CEO. I didn't wave. My hands were full. The guard cleared his throat. Sir Nate looked at me like a stranger waiting to be rid of a problem. "Get her off the property," he said. "Don't let some street woman embarrass me today." His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. "I'm your mother." I don't know why I said it out loud. He gave the smallest shake of his head. Patricia leaned in and whispered something in his ear. He nodded once. When I stepped forward, not quickly, just steady, he reached out with one hand and pushed me backward. Not rough, but enough. I lost my balance. My knee hit the stone step. I let go of the bag and it spilled open. Oranges rolled across the smooth patio, some cracking, leaving juice on the light-colored stone. No one bent down. "Clean that up," Nate told the guard. He turned without another word. Patricia touched his arm. Together they walked back inside. The door shut behind them with a sound that didn't echo. I stayed on the step. The oranges smelled fresh. A few bees hovered near the crushed peel. No one came to help me up. Not the guards, not anyone from the house. I sat there for a while, listening to the quiet behind the gate. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I wasn't anything you could see. Eventually, I stood. My hand left a faint print on the stone where I'd leaned. I picked up the cloth, stained now with juice and dust, and bundled what was left. Some of the fruit was still whole. I didn't look back at the house. At the corner, I passed a family taking pictures in front of the event sign. Nathaniel Monroe Global Foundation launch. I wondered if they would post it online. Maybe in the captions they'd mention how inspiring he was, how far he had come on his own, how powerful it must be to rise from nothing. There was a time I would have smiled at that. Now I just pulled my sweater closer. I walked to the bench where the bus would return in 2 hours. The wooden slats left faint lines across the backs of my legs. I untied the cloth and picked out one orange without cracks. The skin peeled easily. I split it in half slowly. Juice ran into my palm, and I let it. Nothing on me was worth keeping clean anymore. A woman beside me glanced over. "Smells nice." I handed her the other half. She took it without a word. We didn't speak again. I sat there until the bees stopped following. The stain on the cloth grew darker as it dried. I folded it in quarters and tucked it under my arm like something still useful. The wind caught a page of newspaper someone had dropped near the bench. It fluttered, hit my foot, and settled face down. I didn't move it. When the bus came, I stood slowly like the stone steps had stayed in my knees. I didn't check my phone. There were no messages. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years, my mother's maybe, or someone from the church kitchen. "The world will forget you if you let it." It was the kind of sentence no one says out loud anymore. Too simple. Too final. I let the bus door close behind me, and I held the cloth tighter, not to carry anything, but to remember I once did. I used to think the less space I took up, the easier it would be for him to breathe. Back then, I worked both shifts. First, the linen carts at the hospital, sorting soiled sheets and folding the sterile ones. Then straight to the kitchen sink at Salvatore's, where the plates clinked like teeth in cold water. The uniform was always damp. My fingernails stayed trimmed low because bleach got under them otherwise. I didn't mind. I told myself I was building something. He was 12 when I sold the ring. The pawn shop clerk weighed it like it wasn't worth much. It wasn't. The band had a small dent from where the sink pipe under our first apartment had caught my hand too hard one winter. I wrapped it in a paper napkin anyway out of habit. The man behind the counter gave me just enough for a one-way ticket and a second-hand suitcase. Nate didn't know what it cost. He told his college friends he was flying on a scholarship. When he moved into the dorms, I waited to cry until the bus ride back. Even then, it was just one tear that ran into the collar of my coat. I didn't talk about him much at work, not because I wasn't proud, just because it was easier to hold something quietly than to let it get passed around. A year later, his name started showing up on the local news. Breakthrough app created by teen prodigy from broken home. Then, orphan turned entrepreneur inspires millions. I watched the clip in a neighbor's living room because my Wi-Fi had been shut off that week. He looked taller. His hair was cut sharper. He spoke into the microphone like he'd been born holding it. "I came from nothing, no safety net, no handouts." Someone in the room said, "Damn, no mom or dad at all." I said nothing, just sipped my tea even though it was cold. I didn't blame him. Not then. Not even later, when the words turned into features in Forbes speeches at galas, a book deal. People don't pay attention to quiet stories. Maybe he thought if he told the world the real version, they'd stop listening. The only message I ever sent him was when I read about the company's third acquisition. "Proud of you. I hope you're well. I'd love to stop by the office someday if you have a few minutes." The reply came a week later, not from him, but from someone with a double-barreled last name. "Mr. Monroe's schedule is fully committed at this time. Unfortunately, he is unable to accommodate familial visits. Thank you for understanding." The word familial caught in my throat like chalk dust. I pinned that email to the inside of my closet, behind the place where I kept the shoebox of old receipts and faded birthday cards. For some reason, I couldn't delete it. When he won Self-Made Leader of the Year, I streamed it on my neighbor's television again. She had company over. I sat in the far corner so I wouldn't block anyone's view. He wore navy blue and spoke without notes. There was no one behind me, no one holding the net. Every inch I climbed, I carved myself. They clapped like it was poetry. A young woman in the audience wiped her cheek. Later that night, I opened the drawer where I used to keep his report cards. I still had the one from third grade where the teacher wrote "excellent progress." Shows empathy. I folded it back along the same creases. I didn't cry that night either. A few months later, there was an article about him in some luxury magazine. The cover photo showed him standing beside a woman with silver hair and perfect posture. The caption read, "The Power Duo, Nathaniel Monroe and his elegant mentor mother, Patricia Langley." There was a quote. "She believed in me when no one else did. She taught me how to walk into any room and own it." I stared at that sentence longer than I meant to. Not because it hurt, but because I wondered if he believed it. There was a photograph once of him as a baby. He had a mark on his temple the size of a raindrop. It used to fade when he slept. I still remember how light he felt when I first carried him home, how his toes curled inward when I pressed a kiss to the sole of his foot. I kept that photograph in an envelope folded into an old appointment card from the community clinic. The envelope smelled faintly of lemon oil from where it had been stored near my linen drawer. That scent is what brought it back to me whenever I opened the drawer for towels. I didn't touch the photo often. It felt too thin to carry what it once held. I never wrote to the magazines, never corrected the interviews. When people in town asked how Nate was, I just smiled. He's doing what he loves, I'd say. And that was true, I think. The landlord once asked if my son was that tech genius. I nodded. He laughed and said, "So when's he buying you a house?" I laughed too. Not because it was funny, but because it was easier than explaining why I still slept with a space heater and patched socks. I still remember the day someone slipped a church bulletin under my door. The back page had a quote from Corinthians, something about not envying, not boasting, not dishonoring others. I tore off that piece and placed it under the salt jar, not because it gave me comfort, just because it sat still. I made myself small in rooms where his name came up. I stepped aside when praise floated toward him. I bit the inside of my cheek when someone said, "That boy made it all on his own." There's something about silence that reshapes you. It moves through your ribs and into your breath until your own voice begins to sound like background noise. I didn't stop loving him, but I did stop trying to be seen. I didn't open the jar that day. It sat on the kitchen table label smudged from the heat of my hand. I had written April Marmalade in black ink, though the loop on the D had bled into the paper like it always did when the pen ran low. I had planned to bring it as a gift, small, homemade, nothing fancy. But it stayed unopened beside me while I watched the screen. They sat on a couch with curved arms, the kind made for staging, not comfort. Patricia wore pale blue with one of those gold brooches clipped to her shoulder. It caught the studio light just enough to make her face seem younger. She placed her hand on Nate's, and the audience let out that collective breath people do when something rehearsed lands well. "He was just a boy," she said. "I saw him and knew this child needs a mother who will fight for his light." He didn't look at her when she said it, just kept his posture, steady eyes on the host, nodding slightly like he'd been coached through the pacing. "She took me in when no one else would." That was the line. The host leaned forward. A single mother raising a boy with no support. And look at him now, a global philanthropist, a visionary. Truly a story of love. Patricia dabbed at the corner of her eye with a cloth napkin, monogrammed, I noticed. She turned to Nate and said, "You were always mine." The applause came too quickly. A few in the audience rose to their feet. I hadn't expected to be mentioned. I hadn't even planned to watch. The neighbor's TV had been on when I passed by, and the name Monroe caught my ear. I stepped in without knocking. "Isn't that your boy?" she asked, glancing from the screen to me. I nodded, but said nothing. Back home, the jar was still sealed. I set it in the cupboard beside the older ones. Some dated back 3 seasons, gifts I had meant to give but never delivered. The glass lids clinked when I pushed the shelf back in. There's a photograph in the bedroom. He's wearing a paper crown from a fast food kids' meal, gripping a stick with a string on it. He used to call it his sword for dreams. The colors faded, especially near the corners. The bottom right is curled inward. I tried taping it once, but the tape yellowed faster than the photo. I used to dust around it, careful not to shift its angle. Lately, I don't touch it. It leans slightly forward now, as if bowing under time. The envelope from last year is still in the drawer. The card inside reads in silver font, "Wishing you a year of peace and simple joys." Signed from Nate and Patricia. The ampersand was written in her hand, wide loops, firm pressure. His name was printed, not handwritten. I turned it over several times before deciding to keep it. People rewrite things all the time. The woman at the library once told me when I returned a book with a plot that changed halfway through. But not like this, I wanted to say. I didn't. Sometimes I wonder what he tells people about his early school years. The lunches packed in plastic wrap, the shoes half a size too large because I knew he'd grow. The nights I worked both jobs not because I had energy, but because we didn't have a second option. Those details don't shine well on stage. I once heard a podcast clip where Nate talked about building resilience from ground zero. He said, "You either learn to carry your own weight or you stay beneath it." There were things I carried he never asked about. The time he caught bronchitis and I stayed home 3 days straight, risking both jobs. The doctor's copay that came from a payday loan. The way he looked when he finally stopped coughing, curled up under my old coat because our heater had failed again. None of that makes for a headline. I told myself he was curating an image, that maybe he needed distance to survive in that world, that not everything meant to hurt is meant to erase. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't omission. It was substitution. Children become what they have, to my mother once muttered, folding pillowcases with slow, practiced hands. Not always what they came from. She wasn't wrong. One Sunday, I was invited to a small gathering at the church. They showed a short video before the fundraiser. Nate's foundation had donated a new roof. In the clip, he stood with Patricia beside the construction site. She wore a hard hat, smiling up at him. "None of this would have happened without the woman who raised me to believe in worth," he said. The pastor turned to me afterward, all warmth and kindness. "You must be so proud of what she's done." He thought I was a friend of Patricia's. I just nodded and reached for a styrofoam cup of punch that tasted like powdered cherry. I don't speak about it anymore, not even to the neighbor who still shows me newspaper clippings. "You're lucky," she said once. "Some mothers never see their children become anything." I nodded then too, even though I couldn't tell what part I was meant to be lucky for. People ask if I feel forgotten. That's not the word I use. It's more like being painted over. The outline is still there if you look hard enough, but it's buried under a new layer, glossier, smoother, signed by someone else's brush. And I've learned not to point to old edges. Some pictures aren't just missing pieces. They've replaced them completely. And the frame still fits. Some things stop tasting sweet once you learn who's using the recipe. The subject line blinked at me for 2 hours before I clicked. The journey of Patricia Langley, the mother who raised an American icon. It had been filtered into promotions, but the name still reached me like a voice behind a closed door, one I hadn't opened in years. There were 3 photos embedded in the message. One showed Nate half-turned toward her on a panel stage. Another caught Patricia mid-laugh, hand on his shoulder, the hem of her tailored blazer catching in the light. The last image made my palm tighten around the mouse. A caption underneath read, "She used to bike him to school with a jar of homemade marmalade in her bag." It wasn't fiction. It was simply stolen. There was no bike in her past, No orange-stained apron or cracked kitchen tiles where sunlight hit the counter at just the right angle. She had never bought citrus by the bruised crate or scraped her thumb raw zesting fruit when money was short and mornings were rushed. The jar had been mine. And now, so was the story, except it wasn't. I clicked out of the browser and sat for a moment, the outline of the mouse still warm against my fingers. The radio played something stringed in the background. I let it run. There'd been signs in hindsight. Not red flags, those are too dramatic for how these things work. Just quiet replacements. Little edits that didn't make noise at first. Last Thanksgiving, the card came signed, the Monroe Langley family. I remember wondering what that meant. I didn't ask. I had mailed a simple card back. No return address. Just G in the corner. One letter, one breath. That was enough. Later that week, someone slid an article across my doorstep. No note. Just the headline showing. Monroe, the first of his line. It ran in a finance journal, the kind that printed on thick matte stock, and used phrases like lineage independence and self-authored legacy. It described Nate as a man built from blank stone. No mention of blood roots or borrowed ladders, just a clean origin. Some people erase you with ink, others use narrative. I folded the article without reading to the end, but I kept it tucked in the same drawer as a much older document, one printed in blue ink with my signature trailing just slightly at the end. The land deed. I hadn't looked at it in years. I remembered the day I filed it, 1996, late fall. I'd worn a scarf I made from old flannel scraps and brought 2 copies just to be sure. The notary had given me a quiet nod, barely looked up. When I found the document again, the seal had yellowed, but the signature mine still bent slightly at the G. It was the file beneath it that caught me. A notice from Pinnacle Rise Holdings folded in thirds. It looked official, too clean for junk. The words interim transfer and revocable trust stood out in bold. My name appeared once faintly scanned at the bottom. A digital copy of the same 1996 signature cropped and placed just low enough to look real. I hadn't signed anything recently, but Nate had power of attorney. I remembered granting it long ago, back when I thought all names under family meant protection. I'd never revoked it. No one ever told me to. The voice on the helpline was polite. Too polite. According to the records, ma'am, the asset is currently nested within a legal structure affiliated with Pinnacle Rise. We're unable to disclose internal beneficiary tiers unless you're a listed agent. I read the phrase twice, nested within a structure, like it was folded into a shape that no longer looked like mine. There was no argument, no phone call, no warning letter, just a quiet legal redirection made possible by the permissions I once gave to someone who used to ride behind me on a second-hand bicycle, hands in my coat pockets to stay warm. I took out the map, the one with the faded coastal line still marked with my pen from when the land was dry and undeveloped. A small X in the corner where I had once imagined building a cabin, just a one-room place with windows on both sides. I traced it again, finger against the ridge of the paper. It was still there, but only on the paper. I poured myself a cup of tea, though I didn't drink it. The steam fogged the frame of the photo on the table, the one where Nate looked just past the lens, holding a toy model of a lighthouse I once found at a yard sale. He never liked boats, but he liked the idea of something that stayed lit for others. Maybe that part had changed too. Patricia's voice had a practiced rhythm in the interview clip. I watched it once, just long enough to hear her say, "I taught him to hold the pen himself, to write who he wanted to be." He had. And I wasn't in the script. I used to think erasure was a loud thing. Doors slammed, names yelled, records burned. But it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's an email you didn't expect. Sometimes it's a memory dressed in someone else's blouse. And sometimes it's a map that no longer leads to anything that remembers you were ever there. I folded everything back slower than necessary and didn't touch the pen beside the drawer. Some stories aren't corrected, they're replaced. And I've learned not to reach into versions that no longer have room for mine. Some things aren't taken, they're returned by choice. I didn't leave in a rush. Nothing cracked or spilled. No doors slammed, no notes left on the counter. There was no announcement. Just a sequence of simple decisions, each one smaller than the last, until I could no longer be found in the places they once put me. The authorization papers were folded into thirds when I handed them over. The clerk didn't ask questions, just stamped the top page and slid the form back to confirm it had been revoked. I watched the ink dry. That was the only part I needed to see. I hadn't signed anything since Nate turned 23, but my name had lingered like a coat forgotten on someone else's chair. Now it was gone, cleanly, legally, without echo. At the bank, the manager kept referring to your son's provisions. The account bore both our names, though only one had held the password. He offered me a seat. I remained standing. "You sure you want to liquidate the full amount?" I didn't answer. I slid a Post-it across the desk. The number written was final. He nodded, made a copy of my ID, and asked if I needed assistance with anything else. I reached for the small wooden tray of complimentary pens and took one not out of necessity, but as a way to mark that I'd been there. The balance was transferred. The account was closed. My name disappeared from the screen as if it had never belonged there at all. At home, I moved slowly. I had one cardboard box, the kind that used to hold citrus shipments. I lined it with newspaper, not for protection, but for quiet. I wrapped 3 framed photos in an old tax return envelope, tucked 2 outdated certificates beneath a folder of medical receipts, then laid his birth announcement on top without sealing the flap. No tape, no ribbon, just stillness. Across the side of the box, I wrote in red marker, "Do not return." I didn't leave it by the mailbox. I didn't ship it out. I placed it beside the coat rack just underneath the spot where his old baseball cap used to hang. The box didn't need to go anywhere. It only needed to exist, proof that I had taken inventory of the parts no longer mine. The coat wasn't there anymore. Hadn't been in years. But the shape of the hook still bent slightly, as if remembering weight. I packed a canvas bag with 3 blouses, 1 worn sweater, and a navy scarf that still smelled faintly of dryer sheets. I left the nicer shoes behind. I wouldn't need them where I was going. They had heels. I wanted flat soles. Before leaving, I walked the hallway once. Not for sentiment, but to check that nothing had been left on no burner, no faucet, no illusion. The answering machine blinked red. I pressed erase without listening. The cord to the modem came out with 1 pull. I looped it carefully, placed it in a drawer, and closed it without a sound. I didn't call ahead to the place I was going. I didn't tell the landlord I wouldn't be renewing. I didn't give notice. Some exits don't need explanation. The new place had a view of a parking lot and the back of a senior center. I liked that I could see movement without being part of it. The room was small but clean. There was a fan with a pull chain, a hot plate, a window that stuck a little on the left side. I left it open just enough to hear weather. No one followed. No one called. On the 3rd day, a package arrived for the previous tenant. I set it outside and left it there. Unclaimed things should remain untouched. I removed the battery from my phone, not to destroy it, only to quiet it. It sat on the windowsill like a pressed leaf, flattened, colorless, but intact. The only item I placed in the open was the ring box. Empty. Velvet worn to a shine. I kept it on the corner of the desk like a punctuation mark, no ring inside. No message. Just space where something used to belong. A woman at the community center asked me to join the quilting circle. I declined. She smiled anyway. The kind of smile that doesn't expect anything in return. On my way out, I passed a flyer for a talk on repairing estrangement. I read the title, then turned it over to see if anything had bled through. Nothing had. That evening I boiled water, not for tea, just to watch it steam. The silence of the room wasn't loud. It was specific. Nate's name still appeared occasionally in headlines, mostly about market trends, philanthropic donations, vision statements. Once, I saw an article praising the emotional intelligence of his upbringing. They quoted Patricia about instinctively knowing how to mother. I didn't cut it out. I didn't even finish the paragraph. I thought about the time he came home from his first year away and told me not to wait up next time. We'll swing by when it's convenient. Not I'll, we. That's when I started folding his laundry less tightly. I thought about the voicemail he left after his engagement. No invitation, just an update. You'll probably see it in the press. I did. The caption called Patricia the matriarch behind Monroe's rise. I had to look up the definition of matriarch again, just to be sure. I didn't frame the article. I used it to line a drawer. I used to think being a mother meant being part of someone else's story. I don't believe that anymore. If they can rewrite my presence into a convenient paragraph, then I can rewrite my absence into a full sentence, and I no longer owe punctuation to anyone. I used to think you had to carry proof of what mattered, until I realized the things you pack last are often what you never needed to bring. The room wasn't new. It smelled faintly of dusted corners and old varnish, like something had been scrubbed but not replaced. I didn't ask about the previous tenant. I just nodded at the key, ran my thumb across the numbers on the doorframe, and set the bag down where I could see it from the bed. I brought only what no one else had a claim to: a small pot with a dent on the left rim, a folded envelope of orange seeds unplanted, unspoiled, and one letter. It was written in a shaky teenage hand, edges yellowed ink faded at the fold. The paper had been creased so many times it moved like cloth. At the bottom, below the uneven lines and crossed-out words, "Mom, you're the reason I'm not afraid of the dark." There was no date. But I remembered the year, 17. The same summer he lost his first real friend, the one he didn't speak of afterward. I didn't read it aloud. I placed it in the drawer next to the spare key and the loose aspirin packet. The bed had a metal frame that made no sound when I sat down. It felt like the kind of silence you don't owe anyone. That first day, I didn't unpack further. I didn't explore the neighborhood. I boiled water, opened a can of beans, and ate slowly with the small spoon I'd wrapped in a dishcloth. One light on, one slipper slightly torn. I didn't fix it. I didn't cry. But my hands trembled when I peeled the orange. The knife was sharp. The rind broke cleanly, and the scent rose quickly. My fingertips smelled like they had on field trip mornings, when I used to pack 2 slices in a sandwich bag and slide them into his coat pocket without saying. He never noticed until lunchtime, but he always ate them. Back then, he'd come home and place the peels on the counter like trophies. That night, I set half an orange on the windowsill, not as an offering, just to see what would happen to it under streetlight. The juice began to pool slow and quiet, catching light in the indent where a seed had been pulled. I sat with it, watching the glisten turn dull. No one walked past. No child called from the playground. Just that half-orb softening alone on the ledge. The next morning, I didn't move it. Instead, I opened the spiral notebook I'd found in the communal cabinet and wrote one line, then closed the cover. I am still living. But this time with my own name. No signature, no date, just the weight of black ink on cheap paper. I went to the store that day not for anything urgent, just to walk. I passed rows of shoes, each tied neatly with tags. I didn't touch them. I bought flour vinegar and a sponge. The cashier gave me a senior discount without asking. I didn't correct her. Back in the room, I cleaned the small table, then folded the receipt into the seam of the orange seed packet. There were 7 seeds. I counted them twice. Odd numbers used to bother Nate. He always wanted pairs. He once tore a sticker off my car because it had 3 in the plate. "Looks cheap," he muttered. He had started saying things like that around 17. Later that evening, I received a forwarded email to the old account I hadn't deactivated. A newsletter from a foundation. The header had a photo of a school ribbon cutting. Patricia stood beside him holding a pair of gold scissors. The caption, "To the woman who taught me resilience." No name, just that. I didn't click through. I stared at the scissors for a moment, then deleted the email. I'd kept a pair like that, once the kind with ornate handles shaped like a bird. My mother had used them when cutting patterns. I left them in the box I didn't send. The room grew darker without changing. I didn't turn on the second lamp. At one point, a child outside shouted, "It's my turn," then nothing. The next morning, I moved the orange half to a plate. The flesh had caved in, its color dulled to the shade of dried apricot. I didn't throw it away. I left it near the windowsill again. Some things weren't meant to be discarded all at once. I wrote another line in the notebook. They renamed me. I didn't correct them. But I still remember the sound of my own. I made tea. No sugar. No lemon. The letter stayed in the drawer. I didn't read it again. But I remembered the curve of the M and how he'd dotted the I with a small star. He'd only done that once. That was enough. In the evenings, I stitched by hand. Nothing elaborate, just slow lines on an old piece of cloth. The thread snagged occasionally. I didn't pull it tight. I let the knot stay. Some stories don't need to be unraveled. By the end of the week, I planted 2 of the seeds in a recycled container near the window. No expectations, no name tag, they didn't sprout, but I watered them anyway. I used to believe silence was something people gave you out of respect. Then I learned it could be bought and sometimes sold for much more. The envelope had no return address, just the stiff paper and the too precise handwriting of a legal assistant. They always make the curves on the G even too rounded. It didn't say Mom anywhere. Not even Ms. Monroe. Just my name in block letters like I was a name on a file, not the one who taught him how to walk without falling. The letter didn't waste words. Given the current misunderstanding regarding public statements and legal claims surrounding the Pinnacle Rise Foundation, Mr. Nathaniel Monroe humbly requests your acknowledgement as his birth mother in order to preserve the legacy of his humanitarian efforts. I read it twice. On the second pass, I noticed how careful they were not to call me his mother outright. There was a brochure folded inside. Full color, glossy, Patricia Langley center stage. Her hand resting lightly on Nate's shoulder like she'd sculpted him from ambition and grace. The caption read, "The mother behind the mission." There was even a pull quote I'd never spoken. She said I could be anything even when I had nothing. I set it down next to the broken mug I used for pencils. I didn't cry. That wasn't what the letter wanted. The articles came next. First in the small outlets, then a wave across national headlines. Phantom philanthropist, $6. 4 million missing from Pinnacle Rise. Patricia Langley was listed as a co-signer on every major withdrawal. Her title, honorary co-founder and legal guardian. One publication called her a mother in every way but blood. A mother in every way but blood. I didn't leave my apartment. I sat with the brown envelope again. Tucked behind the letter was a printed script. A video proposal. They wanted to stage a quiet reunion, shot in soft lighting framed by books and family photos. Warm tones. I almost laughed. My photos had been boxed up months ago. I hadn't unpacked them. There was a promise, too, full public acknowledgement. Financial restitution. Emotional healing. Like those were line items to be negotiated. I didn't respond right away. I boiled water. I ran my fingers along the edge of the kitchen table. A chip in the varnish caught my nail. Years ago, Nate had dented it with a fork when he was learning to cut sausage on his own. He cried, then afraid he'd ruined something I loved. I told him, "Nothing that carries your mark could ever be ruined." That lie returned like a breath I'd never finished. The next morning, I went to the old cedar box at the back of the closet. The latch stuck just a little. I didn't need to dig deep. Everything important was near the top. A photograph me at 29 holding him outside the county hospital, his eyes barely open, his cheeks still flushed from delivery. I wore a sweatshirt I no longer own, and my hair was darker then. His hand gripped the drawstring like it was a lifeline. Beneath that was the birth certificate, typed official, faded at the edges. No signature from a Patricia. No name but mine. I sent them both. No message except one. I wrote it by hand just beneath the photo. "This is who I've always been. You're the one who changed." The mail clerk didn't ask questions. She weighed the package, sealed it with a strip of heavy tape, and printed the tracking number. It arrived 2 days later. I never got a reply. But that evening, the Pinnacle Rise website went down. Every photo disappeared. The donation links redirected to a blank portal. The banner that once featured Nate's face, lifted, polished, confident, was replaced with a standard error message. This page no longer exists. I watched the news quietly after that. Reporters shifted their focus from admiration to inquiry. They used words like deception, false legacy, fabricated background. A few even used the word mother, followed by question marks. One podcast host said, "He built a myth. He sold us a rags to riches story. Turns out it was someone else's rags and someone else's riches." Another voice. "Who was this woman? She played the perfect mother on stage. But her trail goes back years. Patricia Langley isn't even her real name." The last article I read revealed that Patricia had played the same role twice before. Once for a tech founder in Boston. Once for a rising politician in Nevada. In both cases, she vanished with large sums of donor money right before their public image began to crack. A woman who sold motherhood for equity. They couldn't find her. Her apartment in Florida was empty. Her bank accounts closed. Her known aliases flagged by the IRS. The anchorwoman used the phrase professional maternal imposter. I wrote that down. I'd never heard the word maternal used like that, like a weapon made of silk. When I returned to my room that night, the letter from the lawyer still sat beneath my tea tin. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't needed to. He knew where I was. He knew where I had always been. I looked at the edge of the birth certificate again. Folded, but unbroken. He once said I was the reason he didn't fear the dark. Now I was the shadow that remained after the lights came up. I didn't turn on the lamp. I didn't call anyone. There was nothing to explain. If truth needs a camera, it isn't truth. If love needs a contract, it isn't love. And if a mother must audition for her own place, she was never invited to begin with. The articles stopped coming in envelopes. They were just there on the back page of a circular someone left near the post office, folded beside a coffee cup. I didn't plan to look, but his name, printed smaller than I remembered, found my eye before I could turn the page. It wasn't bold. It wasn't headline-worthy. Just a grainy image of him leaving the courthouse, walking alone, no coat, no entourage. No arms guiding cameras away. The tie was the same one from the last conference I'd watched in silence. The lapel pin was gone. I waited for a caption that might say falsely accused or temporary setback, but there was nothing like that. Just Monroe resigns as CEO. Following federal investigation. I placed the paper down. The stain from the old coffee ring caught the sunlight. I traced it with my finger slowly. That afternoon, I folded towels into triangles and handed them to Lila. She asked if we could try something new. I showed her how to make cranes. She got the wings wrong 3 times before they looked ready to fly. No one asked what I thought. I didn't check the comments. I didn't listen to the podcast where his former assistant called him a crafted illusion. I remembered the way he used to hold a spoon as a child firm, like he needed to prove the bowl couldn't tip. I still have that chipped ceramic spoon. It rests near the window next to the camellia I brought inside when the wind turned. Some things I keep not because they mean something, but because they once did. Each morning, I water the citrus plant that hasn't borne fruit in months. The leaves curl toward the light with no promise. But I keep watering. They said the foundation's accounts were frozen. The donors had vanished like the mother he'd invented. Patricia's name came up again, this time not as a mentor, but as a suspect. I didn't need to look. I knew already. Once years ago, I saw her from across a gala floor. She wore pearls that didn't reflect light and shook hands like paper. Nate had introduced her as the one who saved me. That was the only time he looked away from me all evening. I washed a sweater that afternoon, one from the box I almost donated but didn't. A pale yellow stretched at the collar. The tag reads M. Monroe. I'd written it in permanent marker when I thought laundromats still lost things. It smells of cedar now. Not because it ever touched a forest, but because I placed the sachet beside it months ago when I decided not to throw it out. I got a letter, not from Nate, from a reporter looking for background. He said he wanted to get it right the origin story. He wrote it like it was fiction. I folded the page back into its envelope and left it between the pages of a book I don't plan to finish. Some people fall from grace loudly, with sirens or screaming. Nate fell like a curtain dropped too fast, quiet and final without a cue. There was a time when I'd have felt the sting in my hands, a rush in my chest. Not anymore. The wind doesn't shake me like it used to. I took the camellia outside again, placed it where the sun hits longest near the bench that creaks when no one's sitting. Lila asked me once if I had a son. I said I used to. She didn't ask again. A woman at the community center brought over a pie. She called it comfort food. I served it without saying what needed comforting. Inside the crust was a warmth that filled the air, but didn't stay. I wiped the counter afterward with the same cloth I used when Nate was 12 and spilled cherry syrup. That stain never came out. But the cloth's still here. I've stopped measuring time by events. I measure it in how many leaves fall before the next bloom, how many tea bags steep, before I forget the last thing I overheard. The mailman doesn't pause at my door anymore. No certified letters. No gifts marked urgent. The last text from Nate's old assistant read, "It's all coming down. He might actually lose everything." I didn't respond. Instead, I dusted the edge of a frame that held nothing now. The photo I once kept there, him in cap and gown, me behind him half-cropped, was removed weeks ago. In its place, I taped a torn scrap of brown paper, just the corner of a receipt. I'm not sure where it's from, but it doesn't lie. I no longer need photos to remember. I remember how he used to leave cereal boxes open, how he'd grip the doorframe when lying didn't come easy. People look for sound when something breaks. They miss the quiet. The collapse wasn't loud. It was in the way the spoon no longer warmed in my hand. It was in how the shirt never shrank, no matter how hot the wash. It was in the line I wrote and didn't sign. He fell, but I didn't follow. I sat beside the camellia, pressed my thumb into the soil, and didn't move. Some silences aren't empty. They just hold the shape of what used to matter. I didn't check the mail every day anymore. Some envelopes took their time finding me, and I let them. The box was thin, no return address. Brown paper taped at the corners, slightly uneven. My name in neat print, just Geraldine. No Monroe, no Mrs. Anything. Inside, there was no letter, just the weight of something already known. The photo had been reprinted, glossy clear, no longer yellowed around the edges. The same image, my hands still holding the baby in a blue hospital blanket, my hair tucked under a cap, a wristband visible on my arm. But this time, it sat in a wooden frame, sanded smooth, with a pane of glass fitted perfectly across its front. No cracks. Tucked behind the photo, folded once a note on lined paper, "I'm sorry it took me this long to see what was always there." No name, no signature, not even a date. The writing leaned slightly to the right, a trait he got from me, though he never knew that. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't reread it. I placed the frame next to the orange pot by the window and left it there overnight, letting the light move across it without interruption. I didn't want to claim it. I only wanted it not to disappear again. The next morning, I walked to the municipal office with one document tucked into the inside of my bag and another in my coat pocket. The clerk wore a floral blouse and smelled faintly of peppermint. She didn't look up when she asked for my ID. "I'd like to change my name," I said, offering both pieces of paper. One was the form. The other was a copy of the original birth certificate Nate's with my full name listed as mother, Geraldine Ruth Monroe. She glanced at it, then looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "Is this related?" "No," I said. "Not anymore." The form was simple, a declaration. I filled in each line without hesitation. When it asked for the reason, I wrote alignment, nothing else. I signed it with a pen that no longer scratched. I walked home without looking at anything too long. I passed the alley where a boy once sold candy for a fundraiser. I passed the old laundromat with the windows always fogged from the inside. No one noticed me, and that was fine. At home, I took the original birth certificate and placed it on the kitchen table. The paper had softened at the corners from years of folding. I lit a match and touched it gently to the edge, watching the flame trace the printed borders before curling through my name through the space where I had once written his. It didn't feel like destruction. It felt like punctuation. I didn't take photos. I didn't record anything. The ashes curled inward like they were trying to protect something. I swept them into the dustpan and let them go. Later, I washed my hands and placed the wooden frame back on the shelf near the orange pot. The leaves had grown thick, spilling slightly over the edge. I turned the photo just enough so it didn't face the window, just me. That night, Mrs. Downs from across the hall knocked with a slice of lemon pie wrapped in foil. "We missed you at the tenant potluck," she said. "That peach woman made her terrible chili again." I smiled politely and nodded. She didn't stay long. Before she left, she glanced at the shelf and asked, "Is that your grandson?" I paused for a beat. "A photograph." "I've had a long time." She didn't push, just nodded like she understood something she hadn't been told. The days passed softly. I noticed myself walking slower but holding things steadier. The orange tree had 4 buds. I started sketching again in the mornings, nothing elaborate. Just outlines. Fruit cups, hands. One afternoon, a new couple moved in 2 floors down. Young. She wore mismatched socks and carried a lamp with no shade. He looked tired in the way men do when they've never had enough rest. We passed in the stairwell once. She nodded and said, "You look like someone who makes good soup." It was the oddest compliment I'd heard in years. I replied with, "I've been told my broth isn't the worst." She laughed like it mattered. That night, I found a bag of lentils in the back of the cupboard and soaked them in silence. A few days later, I was walking back from the hardware store with a pack of potting soil when I passed Mr. Turner, who usually worked mornings at the school crossing. He pointed to the bag and asked, "Replanting something you lost?" I shook my head once. "Planting something no one can take." He didn't speak after that, just tipped his hat and returned to his post. I made a small sign for the windowsill planter, second root. Just those 2 words, no dates, no names. I printed it in pencil and laminated it between 2 pieces of plastic from a cereal box. It felt enough. I kept the note, the one with no signature, tucked into the back of the photo frame. Not for proof, not for memory, for quiet. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the window glass. My collar was uneven and my hands looked like folded linen. Not stiff, not soft, just used. The doorbell rang once. I didn't answer. The pie tin from Mrs. Downs still sat on the counter unwiped. I turned it over. On the bottom, etched faintly in black marker, were the words, "Property of someone who always returns things." And I thought maybe that's what I had done too. Returned what wasn't mine to carry. Kept only what didn't demand to be proven. I haven't set an alarm clock in years. My body wakes on its own precise quiet, unbothered by the dark. I tie back my hair, still damp from the night air, and boil water for tea. The mug I use has a small crack beneath the handle, one I never glued. Some things hold better when you leave them alone. Outside the kitchen window, the orange tree leans a little more each season. Its first fruit this year dropped silently onto the grass below. I didn't rush to pick it up. I watched it rest in the soft clover. The peel looked firm, no bruising. A fruit that fell not from weakness but from readiness. The radio still works, though it buzzes on the left channel. The announcer's voice broke in somewhere between the tea, steeping and the knife pressing into an apple's skin. Patricia Langley. Real name Judith Carr was sentenced today to 14 years in federal prison for multiple counts of fraud identity falsification and embezzlement from at least 3 nonprofit organizations. I kept slicing. The blade caught the core cleanly. I didn't pause to react. The announcer's voice moved on, talking about further investigations, potential charges for those who elevated her image, used her as a symbol. The seeds from the apple scattered on the counter. I brushed them into a glass jar I keep beside the sink, half full now. I never plant them. I just like the way they accumulate quietly, without ceremony. Later that afternoon, I found a plain envelope wedged through the doorframe. No return address, no postage. I didn't open it right away. I laid it beside the tea tin and folded a dish towel. Only after I had stacked the plates, swept the floor, and drawn the blinds did I pick it up again. The handwriting leaned left like someone unsure if they should keep going. Familiar curves, a rhythm I hadn't seen in years. I'm starting over in Oregon. No one knows my name here. I teach evening fitness classes. I work mornings in a recovery garden behind the hospital. They don't care who I used to be, so I can breathe. No mom, no apology. Just words laid flat on paper as if nothing could be taken back or reframed. Inside was a small packet. Valencia orange seeds. Not store-bought. Saved and dried by hand. I didn't write back. The next morning, I took the seeds to the backyard behind the shed where the sun lingers longer. The soil was loose from last week's weeding. I dug a shallow hole with a spoon, pressed each seed in slowly, like tucking something down to rest without burial. I brushed the dirt back with the side of my hand. Tend yourself. No one's planting your roots for you, that's all I said. I kept the letter, but not in a drawer. I folded it once, then again, and slid it beneath the lid of my old cookie tin, alongside others' scraps of handwriting, corners of photographs, a pressed flower from Lila's school play. I don't read them. I just let them be near. Lila comes by most days. She's taller now, but still skips every third step on my porch. Sometimes she brings cookies. Sometimes a drawing folded so tightly, the crease cuts through the paper. Last week, she handed me a picture of a tree. One side had roots stretching wide. The other side just a blank sky. "Granny G," she whispered. I drew what lives underground. I pinned it above the sink. On Saturdays, I carry a small paper bag of oranges to the library's front ledge. I never write notes. I don't stay to see who takes them. But they're always gone by noon. The librarian once mentioned how someone leaves gifts from the sky. I didn't respond. I liked that she imagined it that way. One afternoon, a young woman knocked on my door. Not a neighbor, not someone from the neighborhood. She had no camera, no notepad, just her voice and a polite hesitation. "I read about you. Not the whole thing, just the part that felt real." I poured her tea. She didn't drink it. She looked at the tree outside, then back at me. "Thank you for not screaming, but for not disappearing either." I nodded. Deep roots don't ask to be remembered. They just keep holding the ground. She left before the tea cooled. I haven't written a memoir. I haven't accepted interviews. I didn't correct the articles that called me the silent mother or the widow with a lawsuit. They got most of it wrong. But that's what words do. They rearrange things that didn't ask to be explained. I fold napkins in the evenings, the cloth ones that hold their creases like old habits. I brew tea from loose leaves, not for flavor, but for the way the steam curls. I sleep in a bed that creaks when I turn, and I let it creak. I don't call myself a survivor. I don't wait for recognition. I know what I did. I know what I walked through. And I know what I didn't carry out with me. There's a stillness now, not empty, but whole. I don't decorate it, I just live inside it. Each morning, I touch the windowsill where the first orange fell. It's bare now. The tree will bear fruit again. And each time I see the leaves tremble in the early light, I don't say anything out loud. I just think I'm still here, still rooted, without needing proof.